Hi, welcome to Lesson 2, Part 2 of our CBAP certification course. Once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your anchor person. So in Part 1, we took a look at some of the key concepts that we have in business analysis. We defined the term business analysis, and then part of that definition, we saw some of the keywords that are captured in the definition of business analysis. And we said that business analysis is a practice of enabling change in an enterprise by defining needs and recommending solutions that deliver value to stakeholders. That's how we define business analysis. So from that definition, we're able to identify key terms in that definition, which of course includes what we refer to as change, solution, context, value, stakeholder, as well as needs. And I mentioned that all of these now come together to make up what we now refer to as the BACCM. The BACCM in full simply means Business Analysis Core Concept Model. So this is a model that was actually put in place by the IIBA with the latest version of the Babok guide. So the model helps us to analyze any business problem or opportunity or situation that you may have within the organization. So that's one key thing the model does. We'll come back to this slide. But if you take a look at the model, you notice that they are all interrelated. So you can actually define one using the other components of the model. So let me illustrate that. So like I mentioned earlier on, the BACCM is actually a strong model that will enable us to analyze a situation and then be able to proffer solution to such a situation. So we're going to be looking at the major components of the business analysis core concept model. The very first part of it is the need. So in essence, when we talk about the need, a need can be a problem or it can be an opportunity. It could also be a constraint that's imposed, say for example, a regulation. So this is the reason for doing our business analysis work. Now, the second aspect of it is what we now refer to as stakeholders. So stakeholders are individuals, groups, or organizations who are either interested, impacted, or involved in your project. In other words, they are folks who can either impact your project or perceive themselves to be affected project. That's exactly how we define stakeholders. So the interesting thing with the BACCM is that you cannot define any of the components of the BACCM in isolation. In other words, for you to be able to define any component of the BACCM, you would need to also use the other components. So you will need to also analyze the relationship between the other components. So in essence, there is no component that hangs in isolation because each component is defined using other, components. So for example, when we talk about stakeholder, notice that each stakeholder within the organization will have a particular need. For example, if we have about 10 stakeholders, you may have a situation where you have 10 different needs. So we need to be able to determine exactly what the needs of our stakeholders are, and that's exactly the whole idea of the stakeholders part of our BACCM. Now, the third aspect of this business analysis core concept model is the solution. When we talk about solution simply means whatever we're doing in order to solve a business problem or take advantage of an opportunity. So it could be the fact that we're developing a software, or we're carrying out a process change, or we're developing a new solution. It could also be a process change, or it could be an organizational change. So like we mentioned earlier on, no component of the BACCM stands in isolation. So again, we're going to look at the solution vis-a-vis the relationship it has with the other components of the business analysis core concept model. So we're going to be able to determine how will the solution impact our stakeholders, and then also how will the solution address the need for which it was developed to address. Now, the fourth component of the BACCM model is now what we refer to as the context. So basically, let's look at the context as more like the environment within which our stakeholders operate, and then also the solution will operate. So you may have a situation where you have different stakeholders in different locations. say for example in Nigeria, and then you have other stakeholders in, let's say, in India, and then in Canada. So you will notice that to a large extent that the context, the environment is different here, because a solution that may work in a particular location, if you take it to another location, it may not have the same impact. And then also how stakeholders within a particular location may be affected by a particular solution or a need may not be the same with how stakeholders in other locations may also be affected. So that's the whole idea of context. So context basically helps us to be able to make sure that in designing our solution, that our solution is relevant to the environment that we want to be able to implement such a solution. In essence, we need to be able to determine how the stakeholders will be impacted, and then also we need to be able to determine what impact or influence the solution will have on each of the stakeholders. And then also, don't forget, like I mentioned earlier on, we also need to understand the context of the need. And then, of course, our understanding of the context of the need will enable us to determine which solution will best suit that particular environment or context. The fifth aspect of our BACCM, which is arguably the most important part of it, is value. In value is where we talk about the benefit that the stakeholders will receive from this change. And then aside from that, this is where we talk about the reason, the why, the justification for addressing a particular need or solving a particular problem. And that's exactly what the value here refers to. So when it comes to value, again, remember, we're going to interpret this vis-a-vis the relationship with other components of the BACCM. So when we talk about value, we're going to be talking about what value are we going to be giving to our stakeholders. Now, the need might be driven by a particular set of values, and then the value would be brought by the solution, and then the values might differ depending on the environment or on the context. In other words, what a particular set of stakeholders may value within a particular environment might as well not be as valuable in other climes. And that's exactly the whole idea of value. So the last component of the BACCM is now what we refer to as the change. So we can also refer to this as a project. Change is what we're going to do to be able to address the need, and then of course to enable us to proffer solution to the need. So in essence, change is what is going to enable us to move from a current state, which is the need part, to a future state description, which is the solution. Also, don't forget that we also need to analyze this change in line with the other core component. How will the change impact our stakeholders? And then what are the different contexts within which the change is going to take place? And again, we need to also be sure that the change will bring value to our stakeholders as well as to the organization. So the BACCM is actually a great way to analyze any business problem or situation, because one key thing it does is that it enables us to analyze who, what, the where, the why, the when, as well as the how of the situation. So it enables us to be able to determine what the potential output would be in terms of the solution that we're going to be proffering. So this is actually a great tool to enable us carry out our business analysis work. So depending on whatever we do, whatever task or whatever process that we carry out in business analysis, the BACCM is actually a model that would help us to be able to proffer such a solution. So if we go back to our initial slide, so you can see this is quite similar to what I've demonstrated. So you can see that all of the various components of the BACCM are interrelated, and you can define one using the other components. So like we mentioned earlier on, we talked about change. Change, like we mentioned earlier on, could be the project or the initiative that will proffer the solution. We also talked about the need. We said need can either be a problem or an opportunity, while solution is a way to satisfy the need. And then we also talked about stakeholders as folks who may be impacted or impact our project. Then we also mentioned value, which talks about the usefulness, justification, or benefits that we're going to derive from the solution for our stakeholders. And then, of course, context now talks about the environment, or basically the various ways the environment under which the solution will operate, and then also our stakeholders function. So that's the whole idea of the business analysis core concept model. So next, we're now going to talk about the Babok 3 framework. When we talk about the Babok version 3 framework, basically what we're showing you here is all the various components of the business analysis body of knowledge. That's the Babok guide. So the Babok guide is actually made up of 7 very important components, and those 7 components that you have in the Babok guide are, the Babok guide is made up of what we refer to as knowledge areas. So there are 6 knowledge areas in all mentioned in the Babok guide, which we're going to talk about much more later. And then also part of the Babok guide is also what we refer to as tasks. So the Babok guide contains 6 knowledge areas as well as 30 tasks. And then also the underlying competencies. Underlying competencies basically are more like the skills that the business analyst needs to have to be able to effectively carry out his or her business analysis work. Then also we'll talk about the techniques. So in the Babok guide, 50 techniques were referenced. So these 50 techniques are also part of what we're going to be discussing much more later. And then there are also 5 perspectives captured in the Babok guide. And then 4 requirement scheme, which of course includes the stakeholder requirement, the solution requirement, and then also you talk about the transition requirement as well as the business requirement. So all of these are the requirement scheme that we're going to look at much more later, as well as the BACCM, that's the business analysis core concept model. Remember, we just finished talking about the business analysis core concept model, which is of course made up of what we refer to as the need. And then aside from the need, we have stakeholders. We have the need, we have stakeholders, then we have value, and then we have context, then we have solution, as well as change. So these are the various components of the business analysis core concept model which we have earlier discussed. So in a nutshell, this particular mind map gives you an overview of everything that is contained within the Babok guide, and these are the things we're going to be looking at in the course of this very training. However, before we proceed, if you notice earlier on, I made mention of the fact that every ship needs a captain and then a navigator. And then I said that within an organization, the project manager is like the captain, because the captain oversees from a high level perspective all the activities going on within the vessel. So that's essentially the function of the project manager. And then the navigator ensures that the ship is on its right path throughout the duration of its journey. So within the organization, the business analyst is more like the person who plays the role of a navigator. So before the project eventually commences, there is a need for the business analyst to be able to clearly define what is the rationale, the justification for the project. So we cast our mind back to the illustration we did earlier on in the course of our explanation. We made mention of the fact that during the pre-project stage, this is where we determine the rationale. This is basically where we develop the business case. Remember, we mentioned all of this in the last lesson, so you may want to go through the last lesson again if you need a refresher on this. So this is where we develop the business case, and then also we come up with the solution. And then once we come up with the solution, the project manager implements the solution or takes the solution for implementation. And then that's now what forms the project stage, which is part of what, and then of course during the project stage is where the solution is expected to be delivered. And then the post-project stage is where we now begin to talk about the benefits that the project will deliver. So from our analysis so far, remember we mentioned earlier on that within the business analysis body of knowledge that there are 6 knowledge areas. Okay, good. So out of those 6 knowledge areas, one of the 6 knowledge areas, which is strategy analysis, addresses all the activities or all the tasks that will perform pre-project. So this is where we're going to talk about the business case. This is where we're going to talk about being able to determine the current state of the organization and then also defining the future state. All of that is part of what we do during the strategy analysis. So strategy analysis takes part pre-project. Then, of course, during the project, which is the delivery stage of the project, the knowledge area in business analysis that addresses that is what we refer to as the RADD. RADD simply means requirement analysis and design definition. And then, once we're done with the project, that's the post-project stage. The knowledge area that now talks about post-project is what we now refer to as the SE. That is the solution evaluation. So solution evaluation looks at the project after implementation to be able to determine if it was able to add value to stakeholders. In other words, did it achieve the benefit for which it was expected to accomplish? So again, if you notice, these particular knowledge areas, they overlap at specific intervals. For example, the strategy analysis overlaps with the RADD. So it simply means that strategy analysis still continues even within the project, because we need to continuously keep referencing our business case even while delivery is going on, to be sure that what is being done is in line with the rationale or justification as contained in the business case. So this is in line with what we said earlier on, that the business analyst is more like the navigator, ensuring that the project is on its right path throughout its implementation. And then, of course, also notice that the solution evaluation also starts midway in the course of the implementation of the project. Because as we begin to come up with the project deliverables, we now begin to assess those deliverables to be able to determine if they will deliver the benefits. And then again, if we also come up with the final solution, say for example, we come up with the beta version or the trial version, or we come up with the prototype. So we begin to test the prototype, and then of course this will continue even till after the project delivery. So at the end of the project delivery, we review the project in line with the acceptance criteria to be able to determine whether the project actually meets or has fulfilled all of those acceptance criteria as captured in the project scope definition. And then we also continuously check post-project to determine if the project is actually delivering the benefit for which it was expected to deliver. So the knowledge area that talks about that is the solution evaluation knowledge area. So this is part of the 6 knowledge areas that we have in business analysis, and we're going to talk about the rest one after the other in the course of our deliberation. But before we do that, first of all, let's talk about who a business analyst is. So the question now is, who is a business analyst? So we'll talk about a business analyst. This is how the Babok guy defines a business analyst. Babok guy defines a business analyst as any person who performs business analysis activities. So in other words, whoever carries out business analysis function is known as a business analyst. It doesn't matter what the person's job title or organizational role might be. So in essence, what Babok is simply saying that as long as you're carrying out business analysis activities, you are a business analyst. So some of those activities that the business analyst carries out, of course, would include 1, understanding the enterprise problems as well as goals. So you're talking about being able to understand the enterprise problems as well as goals. And then aside from that, also ability to analyze or analyzing needs and solutions. Analyzing needs and solution. Other activities that are performed by the business analyst would include devising strategies, coming up with strategies, driving change, and then facilitating stakeholders' collaboration. So these are some activities that the business analyst carries out within the organization. Like I mentioned earlier on, it doesn't matter the job title. So some very common or popular job titles that, business analysts go by includes a business architect, or you may have a business systems analyst, or a data analyst, for example, or an enterprise analyst, or a management consultant, maybe business process analyst, and then also product owner, requirements engineer, and then of course systems analyst. These, one way or the other, are some of the roles to a large extent within the organization that actually perform the business analysis function. So in a nutshell, we say that the business analyst performs the task as defined in the Babok guide. And then, of course, the business analyst discovers, synthesizes, as well as analyzes information, also elicits needs from stakeholders. So the business analyst, especially within the project planning, will be responsible for requirements gathering and management, also investigates and then clarifies stakeholders' desires, and then determines issues as well as their causes. So these are some of the activities or some of the things that are actually done by the business analyst. And then, of course, like we mentioned earlier on, this to a large extent defines the practice or the profession of business analysis. So beyond that, another keyword we are going to be looking at is the word domain. Now don't forget, we've been using domain repeatedly. And then, of course, part of the reason why this is quite necessary is for us to be able to understand, especially when we use terms like a domain SME, so that you will know exactly what we are talking about, domain SME. So domain SME is simply domain subject matter expert. So when we mention a domain is simply an area undergoing analysis. And that's basically what a domain refers to. So this corresponds to the organization's or unit's boundaries, which of course would include key stakeholders outside those domain boundaries, and then interactions with those stakeholders. So in essence, look at domain as the environment within which we carry out our business analysis work. And that's essentially what the domain refers to. So that environment that's undergoing business analysis within the organization is what we refer to as the domain. Say, for example, we're carrying out a business analysis on our customer service process to be able to determine the efficiency of our customer service processes, and then also how we can enhance our customer service process. The customer service unit becomes the domain, because in this case, that is the area that is undergoing analysis. Another keyword we shall take a look at is what we now refer to as requirement. So when we talk about requirements, the IBA defines requirement as a usable representation of a need. Usable representation of a need. So this is basically how the requirement is defined within the Babok guide. So requirement focuses on understanding what kind of value could be delivered if a requirement is fulfilled. And then when it comes to capturing and representing the requirement, there are some set of tools that can actually be used. Of course, it can actually be a set of documents or tools. For example, say an audio recording, or you could also use business analysis tools like Microsoft Visio or Virtual Paradigm. All of these are specific tools that can actually be used to represent requirements. So remember, we said requirement is a usable representation of a need. Next, we shall now talk about design. When we now talk about design, IBA defines design as a usable representation of a solution. In essence, design focuses on understanding how value might be realized by a solution if it is built. So remember, when it came to requirement, we said requirement focuses on understanding what kind of value could be delivered if a requirement is fulfilled, while design focuses on understanding how value might be realized if a solution, how value might be realized by a solution if it is built. So if you take a look at the two definitions for requirement and design, you'll notice that to a large extent, there's a huge similarity between requirement and design. We define requirement as a usable representation of a need, and then we define design as a usable representation of a solution. Now, one key thing is that both of them are actually elicited, in other words, gathered, collected, and then defined in the same way. So what we're simply saying is that the whole idea of whether a particular item is a requirement or a design is now fully defined based on perspective. So when we talk about from the perspective of a user, a particular set of item can be a requirement. And from the perspective of the solution provider, that in itself can be what we now refer to as a design. So let's do a little illustration. Say this Mr. A, for example, is having a problem within the organization and then decides to carry out, let's say, develop a software that will help in automating processes within the organization. Mr. B is a software developer. Then, of course, Mr. B is the person who is actually carries out software development. So the problem Mr. A has in his organization is issues with customer relationship management. In other words, Mr. A is not able to keep tabs of the number of inquiries, and then also after service delivery, keeping tabs of the customers whom service have been rendered to, in order to be able to see if they can have a repeat business and all of that. So this is the headache that Mr. A has been having. So Mr. A meets with Mr. B and then explains all of these things to Mr. B. And Mr. B says, okay, the solution could be coming up with a CRM software. And then that the CRM software would appear something like this, where you're going to have sales, enquiries, leads, opportunities, and then closed. So these are the features that this CRM software would have. Now let's take a look at this CRM software has been scoped so far. Notice that from the perspective of Mr. A, who has the need, this particular item that we're looking at is his requirement. So in essence, this is the need that Mr. A has to fulfill. But then from the perspective of Mr. B, who is the solution provider, this same set of framework that we have been able to come up with here now represents what we refer to as a design. So this is why I mentioned earlier on that there's a huge relationship or similarity between requirement and design that is simply a matter of perspective. So while requirement is a usable representation of a need, design is a usable representation of a solution. So this is exactly what we explain here, that requirements are focused on needs, designs are focused on solution. So the difference or distinction between requirements and designs is not always clear, just like we've been able to illustrate in the previous slide. So the same techniques are used to elicit, model, as well as analyze both. So requirement leads to a design, which in turn may drive the discovery as well as analysis of more requirements. So within the IIBA business analysis, there is now what we refer to as requirement classification scheme. If you notice earlier on when I was showing you the mind map that talked about the various components of the Babok guide, I told you that we're going to be looking at the 4 requirement scheme for that we have within the Babok guide. So we're going to be looking at those 4 requirement scheme, and that's exactly what we have in this particular slide. So the 4 requirement classification scheme are, first of all, we have what we call the business requirement. We also have the stakeholder requirement. Then there's the solution requirement. And then finally, we have the transition requirement. So those are the 4 requirement schemes. So let's look at these various requirements classification scheme one after the other. So first, let's talk about the business requirement. So when we talk about the business requirement is a statement of goals, objectives, or needs of the enterprise, which is why a project is initiated. So the objectives that the project will achieve and the metrics which will be used to measure its success. So business requirements describe the needs of the organization as a whole and are developed and defined through enterprise analysis. Let's say, for example, we are a transportation company, and then we run the normal taxi. I mean, just like the yellow taxi. However, we've noticed over time that the likes of ride-sharing service providers are gradually taking over the market. The likes of, let's say, Uber, and then Bolt, for example. Or so the moment we decide to go into ride sharing, the major objective or goal that we have in going into ride sharing, which of course in this case can include maybe to increase our profitability, and again to remain relevant, because if we don't change, we may have a situation where in the nearest future people might not be hailing taxi on the street any longer. People might just want to hail taxi from the comfort of their homes, and preferably might want to do ride sharing as against using the conventional taxi, as it were. So that particular objective or goal or the need that the enterprise has, in this case, like I mentioned, profitability and relevance, in order to enable us still remain in business, that's what we refer to as business requirement. So business requirement is basically the need that the organization has that will enable the organization remain profitable, relevant, and then also continue to stay within the business space. Now that we have stated the business requirement, the next is now the stakeholder requirement. So we said that the stakeholder requirement describes the needs that a given stakeholder has and how that stakeholder will interact with a solution. So they are developed and defined through requirements analysis. So remember our ride sharing service that we are hoping to go into. So we're hoping to go into ride sharing services just like Uber. So let's say our own ride sharing, we decide to call it Alpha Taxi. So these Alpha ride sharing services, notice that for us to be able to develop this application in the first place, one, we need app developers as well as development companies. Aside from that, we're also going to be putting into consideration the needs of our users or customers, as the case may be, and then also regulatory as well as legal requirements. So here you talk about the government and then also cities where the app itself would run. So all of that is part of what we put under consideration when we talk about the stakeholder requirement. So stakeholder requirement basically talks about the needs of your stakeholders. In essence, from our developers, what are their needs? And then also to our users, customers, exactly what are they looking for in a ride-sharing application? What are they not getting? What would be our unique selling point? What would differentiate us from other service providers? The government, what is the requirement? So all of this put together. Also, don't forget our staff members, people within the organization. So all of these stakeholders, what are their requirements? So all of this put together is what we refer to as the stakeholder requirement. So the next is now the solution requirement. So this defines the characteristics of a solution that meet business requirements as well as stakeholder requirements. So they are developed and defined through requirement analysis. So in essence, remember I made mention of the fact that the organization wants to go into ride sharing. So the solution requirement would now be what the design we're going to be able to come up with in order for us to take advantage of this opportunity. In other words, for us to be able to meet this particular business need. So those set of requirements that will help us in meeting this business need is what we now refer to as the solution requirement. So in this case, our solution requirement, of course, will be our ride-sharing application itself. And then aside from that, it's also being able to put in place processes as well as functions that will enable us to seamlessly operate this ride-sharing application that we plan to develop. So the solution requirement is typically divided into two, which are what we now refer to as the functional requirement as well as non-functional requirement. So the functional requirement describes the behavior and the information that the solution will manage. So they describe the capabilities the system will be able to perform in terms of behaviors and operations. So in essence, the functional requirement is what the solution does. So functional requirement is where you talk about the features, the characteristics. So basically, what makes the solution work? All of that is what we have in the functional requirement. So this is the major thing that the solution does. So if we go back to our ride-sharing app, part of the functional requirement, of course, could mean the fact that users are able to request for rides. For example, users are able to make their payment using, the app itself. Users are able to track their movement. Users are able to review, give feedback on drivers' performance. Users are able to know how far away the next vehicle is from them. Users are able to order for a taxi, for example, without leaving the comfort of their homes. So all of this is what we now refer to as a functional requirement. That's why I said functional requirement is basically what the solution does. Now, the functional requirement now captures conditions that do not directly relate to the behavior or functionality of the solution, but rather describe environmental conditions under which the solution must remain effective. So in essence, non-functional requirements here are things that need to be in place for our solution to thrive. Things that need to be in place so that our functional requirements can actually work. That's what we refer to as a non-functional requirement. So notice that even if we develop this ride-sharing app, and for example, internet connectivity is poor within our country or within our environment, or you also have a situation where the level of adoption of new technology is low, you may also have a situation where that begins to affect the solution itself. So all of that is what we now refer to as the non-functional requirements. That is, the things that need to be inherent or conditions that we need to have within our environment that will enable the solution to work effectively. And then, of course, we now have the transition requirement. So transition requirement describe the capabilities that the solution must have in order to facilitate transition from the current state of the enterprise to a desired future state, but that will not be needed once the transition is complete. Now, for us to be able to now transit from the normal taxi hailing process that we have, where people just, wave our taxi on the road and then book a ride, in order for us to be able to transit from that to a ride-sharing system, we may need to build the capacity of our team members. So in essence, we need to do training, letting them know, okay, this is how the new solution will work. We may also need to prepare what we refer to as a change strategy. Change strategy simply means, how are we going to be able to bring in this new solution so that it does not in any way disrupt our service provision or lead to some level of huge turnover within the organization that would disrupt the operations of the business. So all of those requirements that we need to meet that will enable us transit from a current state to a desired future state, that is now what we refer to as the transition requirement. So vivid example of transition requirement includes training, change strategy. It could also be within the solution itself, the capability that the solution should have so that it can migrate. In other words, it should be upgradable. It should be such that we can actually upgrade, say, from version 1 of alpha, that's our ride-sharing app, to version 2, or without users losing their data, for example, or without users being distraught. So all of those functionalities is what we now refer to as a transition requirement. So in summary, these are the 4 requirements classification schemes that we just mentioned, which are the business requirement, the stakeholder requirement, the solution requirement, as well as the transition requirement. So in order to document our requirements, there are some very popular requirements documentation that you can actually use. We have what we call the BRD. BRD simply means business requirements document. So they comprise both the business as well as the stakeholder requirement. So within a project, the BRD focuses on the business perspective. And that's why I say that it's made up of the business requirements. So majorly it focuses on the business perspective. And then it also captures the needs and expectations of our customers. So which in this case is what we now refer to as the stakeholder requirement. So in its simplest term, the BRD indicates what the business wants to achieve. And that's exactly what the business requirements document, or the BRD, captures. Then we also have the FSD, which is the functional specification document. So just like the name sounds, the functional specification document is now the document that is used to capture functional requirements. The FSD is used to capture functional requirements. So the document specifies the function that a system or a component must perform. So it typically describes what is needed by the system user, as well as requested properties of inputs as well as outputs. Then you also have the solution requirement specification, SRS. So the SRS, just like the name sounds, now describes what the solution will do and how it will be expected to perform. So in a nutshell, the SRS describes the functionality the product needs to fulfill all stakeholders' needs. So in essence, basically, the components that the solution will have in order to meet the needs or expectations of our stakeholders, that's exactly what the SRS contains. So these are some very popular requirements documents that can help us capture requirements, especially within our software development, process, or our solution development, process, to effectively help us in being able to capture relevant requirements. So let's take a look at this exercise. Sale Consulting is developing a new ordering system app. The app will enable users place orders on any of Sale Consulting products using any internet-enabled device, for example, laptop, tablet, and mobile phones. This app will work on all system operating systems around the world and requires at least a 3G network. You've been appointed as the business analyst for this project. Your first task is to identify all the various requirement categories that this app will meet and how it will demonstrate compliance. So I want to see if you can actually perform this particular exercise. So you can pause this video for now and then see if you can identify this set of requirements. Okay, good. So please note that the solution to this is actually included in the other documents that have been attached as a part of this very course. So in this particular lesson, we took a look at the BACCM, that's the Business Analysis Core Concept Model, where we took a look at the various components of the BACCM, which of course includes change, needs, stakeholders, value, context, and then solution. We also took a look at what we refer to as requirements and designs, where we tried to talk about what requirements and designs actually refer to. And then further, we took a look at the 4 requirement classification scheme. Here we mentioned the 4 requirement classification scheme to include the business requirement, the solution requirement, the stakeholder requirement, as well as the transition requirement. This is where we're going to be stopping the part 2 of our chapter 2, which is Introduction to the Babok Guide. I hope this particular video has been very informative for you. I want to thank you for listening. In the next lesson, which is in chapter 3, we shall now take a look at the various knowledge areas that we have in business analysis. See you in the next lesson.